The Intellivision is a fascinating system nowadays. Released by Mattel Electronics at the tail end of 1979, it was the first real challenge to Atari's dominance. Despite this, the two systems couldn't be any more different, with the 2600's simplicity and ease of access clashing with the Intellivision's power and complex controls. However, one of the most interesting things about the Intellivision was its sheer number of different versions. During this time period, it wasn't uncommon for companies to license out production of their systems to different retailers or manufacturers under a different name to ease things such as distribution. While most of these variants looked identical to what they were based on, with only different logos or at most different colors to distinguish them from one another, Sears took a completely different approach when they came out with their own version of the Intellivision, the Super Video Arcade. What's so special about the Super Video Arcade? This thing is fucking massive! It also looks completely different from the ordinary Intellivision, with the presence of wood paneling being pretty much the only thing the two have in common. While many consoles of this period look distinctly dated, this thing takes the cake with its cream and brown styling. As well as this, there's some nice details here, such as the power and reset buttons being styled to look like the joypad on the controller. While it's not the most flashy or modern looking, there's something to be said for things you can just put down on your shelf and what do you mean? That's always been there. The Intellivision's controllers have always drawn ire for their seemingly unnecessary complexity and clunkiness. There's a 16-way control pad at the bottom that doubles as a button, 12 more buttons laid out in a keypad fashion on top, and 4 more action buttons on the sides. To ease potential confusion, some games come with plastic inserts that you can slide over the keypad in order to know which button does what. Unfortunately, this has the side effect of making the buttons themselves highly unresponsive when trying to press them. While the Super Video Arcade's controllers are nearly identical to the ones used for the Intellivision, there are still one or two slight changes that were made. It features 2 slots to store the controllers much like the Intellivision, but with them having been moved from the sides to the front of the system. However, the biggest difference here is that as opposed to being hardwired to the system similar to the original, they instead use a similar 9-pin connector to the Atari 2600 and Sega Genesis. This got my hopes up at first, as I thought I could substitute the controller for something a bit more ergonomic. Guess what you can't do with the controllers? To add insult to injury, the controller ports are an extremely tight fit, which when combined with the awkward angle makes me think these things were only meant to be removed in the event of failure. In fact, all of the ports on this system are extremely tight, with cartridges requiring some force to fit into the cartridge slot. It's so bad that some third-party games, especially those made by Coleco, require you to resort to desperate measures. Alongside the system itself, Sears additionally re-released several first-party Intellivision titles under the Super Video Arcade banner. These are just standard Intellivision cartridges, no different in design from the ones made by Mattel Electronics, but what's interesting here is the packaging. The boxes fold open, revealing a slot to keep the manual and controller inserts, as well as a storage area for the cartridge. In an era where most video game packaging was simply intended to be little more than protection for the game and manual while on store shelves, it's a welcome surprise to see such a level of care here. To me, the most interesting one of these games is Astrosmash. It's one of only a few arcade-style titles released under the Sears label, but it's a pretty solid game reminiscent of Space Invaders and other similar fixed shooters of the time. The basic gameplay is pretty simple, moving horizontally while destroying falling objects in order to score points, but there's also some unique features to keep you engaged. This is actually a fairly innovative game from 1981, featuring a number of quality-of-life features making use of the controller's extra buttons. First of all, there's the firing modes. Normally, shooting is done using the action buttons on either side of the controller. These aren't always the most responsive, especially when it comes to rapid pressing. However, by hitting the auto-fire button on the controller, the game shoots for you, kind of like a predecessor to turbo buttons on later controllers. Unfortunately, the rate at which it shoots is too slow to be able to consistently hit smaller objects as you move around. As a result of this, the increased precision of the normal fire mode makes it a much better option for most situations, even if it means resorting to the spongy side buttons. To spice up gameplay, several new types of enemies start to appear as your score increases. These come in the form of spinning blades that cost you a life if they reach the ground, guided missiles that track you as they fall, and UFOs that hover at the top of the screen and drop bombs until destroyed. Overall, Astrosmash is a pretty good game that I could play for quite some time before getting bored. There's enough here in terms of gameplay to distinguish itself from similar games, and that's before getting to the new features it brought to the table. However, there's still a few issues, such as being forced to essentially choose between the lesser of two evils when it comes to your firing mode, that keep it from true greatness. Despite this, it's still an enjoyable experience, and one that I definitely recommend trying out. The same goes for the Super Video Arcade itself. Despite its flaws, it's a pretty good Intellivision, and one of the more unique ways to experience the system's library of games. Sure, it may have next to no differences to the original system from a usage standpoint, all for a higher price, but it still has one key advantage on its side. Did I mention that it's massive? Oh yeah, it's also brown.